The value of information depends heavily on timing. And the best information in the world doesn't help if it comes too late. And so what matters right now are the decisions that growers are currently facing. Things can change from week to week, and your management decisions need to be able to adapt to that. One week there can be no bugs, and next week there can be armyworms everywhere. Farming success, and I hope you hear what I'm about to tell you, farming success comes down to decision quality. Ask yourself this question when you roll up to one of your farms: what gives me the best probability of success on this acre? Because at the end of the day, yield matters, but profit matters more. No hype, no theory, no pretending that there's just one magic answer for every grower or every farm. Just real conversations about what's working and what's actually making money. Especially these days, there's a lot of noise. There's always another product, another recommendation, another opinion. Ask 3 guys what to spray tomorrow, and you'll get 3 different opinions. You learn a lot when you get the opportunity to see what's happening across a broad geography. Somebody the other day asked me a question. They said, what do you think is the biggest waste of money in agriculture? And I got to thinking about that question a little bit, and I thought maybe a better way to approach the answer to that is this.
Dirt, dollars, and data on Cam Seeds Radio.
I'm Chad Mustang, Seed Pro with Cam Seeds, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to the very first episode of this podcast. And I've been doing this for about 30 years now, and really longer than that. I grew up in and around farming and been around it my entire life. It's basically been my entire life. And I was thinking this morning about a story. When I was growing up, I was on the farm with my grandpa, and we were around the shop there, getting ready to go mow some hay and rake some hay, and we were getting the tractors ready. And I was probably 11 or 12 years old, and all of a sudden one of the neighbors comes driving in the driveway, and he pulls up, he gets out, he walks over to my grandpa, and they start having a conversation. Of course, I'm 11 or 12 years old. My level of patience was pretty small, and they sat there and talked for what seemed like an hour. Here I'm ready to go. And so finally, I walked over to him and I said, "Hey, are we gonna go get something done today?" And the neighbor, he looked over at me and he said, "Hey, Chad," he said, "what are you gonna do today?" And I said, "Well, I guess I'm gonna go rake some hay if we can ever get out of here." And he laughed and he said, "Well, you need to be careful." And I said, "My grandma tells me that all the time." And he said, "No, that's not the kind of careful I'm talking about." He said, "If you ever get farming in your blood," he said, "you'll never get it out." And I was, again, probably 11 or 12 years old when that happened, and here we are decades later, and I'm still doing it, still involved in it every day, and still really enjoy it. So I still remember that story because after all these years and over the years, I've had the opportunity to work with a number of different ag retail companies and work with a lot of different growers, and I've seen a lot of different management styles. And one of the things that I've realized is you learn a lot when you get the opportunity to see what's happening across a broad geography, especially here in Southeast Kansas. I've seen what works from Kansas City all the way down to Grove, Oklahoma, and really everywhere in between. There's different soils, different weather patterns, different management styles, different growers. And when you've been around that many acres for that many years, one of the things you notice is that patterns start to show up. And you start noticing what consistently works and what consistently doesn't work. And I think it's that broader perspective that's valuable, because most growers, they really only get to see what's happening on their farm or their operation or their immediate area or what their neighbors are doing. But when you're working across a territory that's as broad as what I just described, you get the opportunity to compare a lot of things side by side. You see what patterns are holding up under stress. You see what chemical programs are consistently performing. You see what management decisions tend to pay and those that tend not to pay. And really, that's what I want this podcast to be about. No hype, no theory, no pretending that there's just one magic answer for every grower or every farm. Just real conversations about what's working and what's actually making money. And really, especially these days, there's a lot of noise. There's always another product, another recommendation, another opinion. Ask 3 guys what to spray tomorrow, and you'll get 3 different opinions. And sometimes I think people lose sight of the fundamentals that actually drive long-term success. One of the things that I've become more and more convinced about over the years is this, that farming success, and I hope you hear what I'm about to tell you, farming success comes down to decision quality. All right, it's really about decision quality, and I'm not talking about farming success in any given year. This year could be a bad weather year, and regardless of all the decisions you make, you may not make any money because of the weather. But consistently over time, what I've seen is farming success comes down to decision quality, not just products, but decisions. Things like the right hybrid, planting the right hybrid on the right acre, the right timing, the right management approach, understanding risk, understanding economics, because at the end of the day, yield matters, but profit matters more. I mean, at the end of the day, why are we doing this? We're doing this to make money. And so, yeah, yield is important, but what's really important is profit. I remember a couple of years ago, I was over on the Missouri line and I was visiting a grower over there, and we talked extensively about how he had one farm that the corn had a 230 bushel average yield. And we talked extensively about all the things that he did to get it to that level. And then a little while later, I drove about 40 miles to the west of him, and I met with another grower who we were talking about a farm that he had that the corn average yield was 185. And we talked extensively about what he had been doing. And at the end of all of that, what I learned was the guy who made 230 bushel, he actually made less profit than the guy who had the 185 bushel yield. Well, why is that? Because yield doesn't always, it's not the entire driver of profit. You have to think about your inputs and return on investment. And so yield does matter, but profits matter more. And so that's one of the things that I want this podcast to be about. And another thing that I want to do with this podcast is I want to make sure that we're talking about things that are timely and relevant to what's actually happening in the field right now. I don't want this to just be random ag talk. I want it to be useful. I want to use this. I want to give information that helps you make better decisions in real time. And so what I mean by all of that is the conversations are going to follow the seasons. Okay, so right now, for example, it wouldn't do me much good at all to sit here and spend a bunch of time talking about wheat fungicides and wheat fungicide timing and should I use Prosaro Pro or Miravis Ace, because that season's already passed. That decision's already been made. We won't deal with that for another year. And so what matters right now are the decisions that growers are currently facing. Things like soybean herbicide programs, double crop bean management, seed selection, again, chemical programs, the right hybrid on the right dirt. Those are the kinds of things that I want to focus on as we move forward, because the value of information depends heavily on timing. And the best information in the world doesn't help if it comes too late. And that's one of the advantages of having these conversations, I think, in podcast form, is that every week we can talk about what's happening right now, what decisions are coming next, what problems are showing up, and what I'm seeing across the territory. Because conditions change, markets change, the weather changes, disease pressure changes. In a month, southern rust could be blowing in, and then again, maybe it's not. So things can change from week to week. And your management decisions need to be able to adapt to that. And so that's another big part of Dirt Dollars and Data, is bringing timely information, relevant information that helps you make better decisions while those decisions still matter. And then the last thing that I want to mention here before we really get rolling into this is, after this first episode, I'm going to routinely have guests on the show as well. So, and those guests are going to be people that are very experienced in their specific fields of agriculture. People that are in the field every day, people that are seeing real world results, people that are dealing with the challenges that we face here in Southeast Kansas. And the goal of those conversations is going to be the same as everything else that we do here. The information is going to be practical, relevant, and able to help you make better decisions. Because as I said a minute ago, things can change quickly. One week there can be no bugs, and next week there can be armyworms everywhere. And so I think it's important that we have timely information. And I think it's also important that we hear different perspectives from people who are actively involved in different aspects of the industry. And so we're going to cover a broad range of topics, things like seed selection, chemical programs, agronomy, markets, probably throw in some equipment and technology once in a while, management decisions. That's going to be the topics. And the common thread through all of this, though, is how do we make better decisions? How do we become more efficient? And how do we improve profitability? Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters. So with all of that in mind, let's dive into a handful of things that I kind of wanted to talk about today. And I wanted to start with this. Somebody the other day asked me a question. They said, what do you think is the biggest waste of money in agriculture? And I got to thinking about that question a little bit, and I thought maybe a better way to approach the answer to that is this. What do I consistently see people doing that ends up costing them money in agriculture? I mean, obviously there are a lot of ways to waste money, but I think my answer here might surprise you a little bit, because I don't necessarily think that it's always about tech or equipment or products. It's about decisions. It's about decisions. A lot of times it's about selecting the right products and then, just as importantly, using them at the right time. And when I say products, for the most part, I'm talking about seed and chemistry. And since we're in soybean season right now and corn planting is basically wrapped up for all practical purposes, let's talk about soybeans for just a minute. Because things like seed selection still matter in soybeans. We could sit here and argue all day long about the importance of seed selection in corn and planting the right corn on the right dirt. I don't think anybody questions that, but it still matters in beans. I think back to when I was a kid, again, back to when I was growing up, we planted bean varieties or hybrids like Hutchison's and Forrest and Essex and Bays. And I remember those bay beans, you had to be careful where you planted those, because if you planted them on bottom ground, they get 6 foot tall and end up like a forest and be a disaster to cut. And so seed selection still mattered back then. And it still matters today. Things like maturity matters, row spacing matters, management style matters. Some beans, some variety of beans, just like I talked about the bays, some get taller and skinnier, some are shorter and bushier, some branch out more, some handle stress more, some close the row faster. All of those things are things that influence the management decisions later. For example, the faster you close the rows, the less opportunity there is for weed pressure. I mean, that's just common sense. So if you're drilling beans versus planting beans on 30s, your chemistry program should look different. Your weed control strategy should look different. Residual timing might look different. Canopy development changes all of that. All of those things matter. As I begin to answer this question, where are people wasting money the most? One of the things that I've gotten a lot of questions about here lately is maturity. What maturity should I still be planting, or what should I plant now, especially with double crop beans or guys that still have early beans left to finish? Well, historically around here for quite a few years now, most of the beans have been 4.6, 4.7, 4.8, 4.9s. the maturity of beans that have been planted around here for quite some time, whether you're talking about early beans or a double crop situation. But I can also remember it's probably been 15 years ago or so where we were planting a whole lot more 5.2s, 5.4s, 5.6s, and those were the beans that were planted around here. You planted a 4.8 or 9 early, and double crop, it was all in the 5s. And I remember Asgrow had I believe it was a 5605 that was super popular double crop bean around here. But over time, we've seen things trend to the shorter side. And I think the biggest part of that is genetics. Genetics have just simply improved. Today's shorter maturity beans don't necessarily behave like they did 15 or 20 years ago. The yield potential is better, standability is better, disease packages are better, stress tolerance is better. And so I think a lot of those maturity decisions are more nuanced than they used to be. And so to really finish up my 2 cents, so to speak, about maturity decisions this time of year, obviously maturity decisions for beans planted in late March or April or even early May are a lot of times different than the beans that you'd plant at the end of May or all the way up through the 4th of July. But again, what I'd say about this is right now the genetics from the majority of seed companies that seem to really be working well in our area are those beans that range in that 4.6 to 4.9 maturity range. That seems to be the sweet spot with what's consistently working across the entire geography. And so once we get past that maturity discussion though, the next question becomes, okay, or what in my mind, what the next question should be is, what do those beans actually look like? Because once you narrow the maturity down, then the conversation should shift into what I call plant architecture or growth habit and management style. Again, are they taller beans? Are they skinnier beans? Are they bushier beans? How quickly do they canopy? How well do they branch? How well do they handle stress? Those are all things that matter. And that's where working closely together with the Seed Pro becomes important, because those characteristics help determine how you're going to manage that crop. When we start talking about seed selection here for soybeans that are going to be planted in the next 30 days, one of the things that's of utmost importance in all of the things that I've said here is stress tolerance. Stress tolerance should really be a big part of the whole conversation. You want to understand how well a bean handles stress, because that can absolutely affect where it should be planted and how it should be managed. Now, maybe some of you that are listening to this, you're farming in God's country and every acre looks perfect and you can plant one bean across every acre and never think twice about it. And I know there's some beans out there that are actually pretty versatile. Some beans are kind of considered an all-purpose bean that you can plant almost anywhere, and they consistently perform well. But there's a lot of beans that aren't that way. There are beans that do really well on tougher dirt. There are beans that love highly productive ground. There are beans that handle stress well, and there are beans that don't. A good example of that is bottom ground. There are some beans that get too tall, too bushy, and they lodge if they're on dirt like that. They fall over. And that can create, obviously, some harvest issues. There are some beans that pod really low to the ground. And you need to know that, because if they do, you don't want to plant that on a rocky farm. I don't have to tell you what kind of problems that causes. So again, matching the right bean to the right environment still matters. And especially this time of the year, as we get into double crop beans, stress tolerance is really important, because we all know what summer's like around here. So finding a bean that can handle stress well matters a lot. And to me, what do I do when I'm trying to find a bean that can handle the stress well? Well, that's where data becomes super important. I start looking at plot data, and I start looking at side-by-sides, and you can do things like talk to your neighbor, talk to your Seed Pro. But what you want to look for is something that consistently performs over multiple environments and multiple years, if possible. Because what really matters is consistency. Just about every seed company has one flashy plot winner that was at the top this year and maybe won the plot in 2 or 3 places. But what really matters is what consistently performs under real world conditions, okay? What I'm looking for when I look at data is I'm looking for those beans that are hanging in there consistently from Kansas City to Grove, and they're always in the top 3 or 4 or 5 even, consistently across the broad geography and in a broad range of environments. Now, really, to tie all of this back together into the bigger conversation about where do I see people wasting money in agriculture, all right, this is one of the areas, okay? I see people making poor seed selections. And it's not necessarily because they picked a bad bean, but it's because they picked the wrong bean for the environment or the management style, okay? Now, the second place that I see a lot of money being wasted, and this might be even bigger, all right, is chemistry selection. Because your chemistry program should really match your production system. When you're drilling beans or planting beans on narrow rows, your herbicide program should really look different than a herbicide program that's designed for beans that are planted on 30s, especially on the residual side of it. And where I see a lot of money being wasted is this. I'll see somebody go out and buy a super nice, premium, expensive residual herbicide package, and then they'll go apply it to drilled beans where the canopy is going to close super quick. And then maybe somebody else will go out here on beans that are planted on 30s where the rows are going to stay open a lot longer, and they're trying to get by with something like metribuzin or generic Val or the cheapest residual that money can buy. And really that's backwards. Again, all these decisions tie together. Row spacing affects the canopy affects weed pressure affects the herbicide strategy, and the herbicide strategy affects the profitability. It's all connected. And then lastly, another thing that I don't want to leave out that may be, and quite possibly, the biggest waste of money that I've ever seen is timing. Timing is absolutely critical. The timing of herbicide applications matter, the timing of fungicide applications matter, the timing of insecticide applications matter. I mean, going out and spraying just simply because the neighbor's spraying, the co-op is rolling, or somebody else is doing it, that's not a management strategy. You need to be looking at your farm, your fields, your weed pressure, your disease pressure, your environment, because every farm is different. And that's where working closely together with somebody who understands your operation can really help, because timing changes everything. You can make what I would call a fairly average decision, but execute it at exactly the right time and get a better result than somebody making a premium decision at the wrong time. Timing is super important. And weeds are a perfect example of that. I mean, letting weeds get too big too early, I mean, everybody knows what that does to yield. You don't get those bushels back. You really don't. And so timing matters. And that's probably one of the biggest themes that I want people to understand from this podcast moving forward is agriculture and farming is rarely about one single magic product. All right, it's really about putting together a complete management system where the seed selection, the chemistry, the timing, the environment, and the management style all work together, okay? And maybe that's really the best way to wrap all of this up, is at the end of the day, farming is really just a game of probabilities. And I think the best operators, what I've seen over my 30 years of experience, is the best operators understand that. There's no perfect system. There's no guaranteed outcome. There's no product that eliminates all the risk. Farming just doesn't work like that. I mean, all of you, that you can make every decision correctly. You can make perfect decisions all year long and still get hammered by the weather. I mean, that's just part of farming. And so what good management does, and I hope you hear this, what good management does is it stacks probabilities in your favor. And that's really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to increase the likelihood of success over time. And when you start thinking that way, your decision making changes. Okay, so instead of asking yourself, what's the answer here? What's the magic product? What should I plant? You really need to start asking yourself this question. If you don't take anything else away from this podcast, take this away. Ask yourself this question when you roll up to one of your farms. What gives me the best probability of success on this acre? I'm going to say that again. What gives me the best probability of success on this acre? That's a completely different mindset. And usually the operations that I've seen that consistently perform well over time are the ones that are making decisions based on probabilities and consistency. Not hype, not fear, not what everybody else is doing, just disciplined decision making over and over and over. And I think sometimes in ag, we get too focused on yield and too focused on trying to hit home runs and trying to find a miracle hybrid and a miracle product and a miracle program, when in reality, long-term profitability usually comes from stacking a bunch of good, smaller decisions together over time. Good seed selection, good timing, good weed control, good fertility, good management. None of those things by themselves guarantee success, but together they dramatically improve your odds. And I think that that's probably one of the biggest things that I've learned after being around this industry as long as I have, is that the best growers aren't the guys that are always doing the most. Usually they're the guys that are just making the fewest bad decisions. That's the big difference. And that's what I really want Dirt, Dollars, and Data to be about going forward. Trying to cut through all of the noise, focus on better decisions, better management, better timing, and better probability-based thinking. Because as farming is difficult enough already, I mean, right now in this environment, margins are tight, costs are high, risks are big. And anything we can do to improve that decision quality and improve consistency matters. And so that's what I want you guys to take away from this episode. And I appreciate everybody listening. Moving forward, next week, I'm going to dive in and have a guest with me, and we're going to talk about seed treatment. I know there's a lot of folks out there who may or may not believe in seed treatment. We're going to talk about all of the metrics involved in that. We're going to talk about return on investment. Does it pay to do it for double crop beans? Does it not? We're going to go through all of that together, and hope you guys will tune in then. I'm Chad Mustang, and this is Dirt, Dollars, and Data.
Dirt, dollars, and data.